There are two stages for game developers. I know everything, and I know nothing / I hate my life. If you're here, I'm assuming that you're in the second category and that you're using GDevelop and maybe you ran into a few bugs. But let me tell you now, don't give up. As quickly as possible, I'm going to walk you through troubleshooting the events of your GDevelop game with a little help from my good friend Mr. Debugger, which is made up of 3 parts: the inspector, the console, and the profiler. After that, stick around for a few bonus tips. Within GDevelop, to open up the debugger, you need to go up to the top center and click on Start Preview and Debugger, or use the hotkey F6. This opens up a preview of your game, but it also opens a new tab for the debugger. The debugger is made up of 3 parts: the inspector, the profiler, and the console. To toggle the profiler and console, just click on these buttons on the top right. For now, we'll hide the profiler and console. To begin using the inspector, click on Refresh. For now, I'm going to collapse the scenes, and what we can see here are the global variables. In this case, I have 3 global variables. Now keep in mind that the pane on the right here will update depending on which of these tabs you've clicked on. I have scene variables, instances, and so on. If I click on a game scene, I have layers, timers. Now what's super useful about the scene panel here is at the bottom underneath the timers, you can actually instantiate new objects into your running game. In this case, my game is about pirates, and if I want to add a pirate to the scene, I simply click on one of the objects, and it's going to create it at position 00. In this case, you can see them dropping up from the top. Next, we have the instances. These are the individual objects that exist within the scene. You may or may not have any instances, and the number in the parentheses next to each object will tell you how many exist. In this case, I have 1 player character called platformer character, and then I've got 4 coins. Now, if I want to look at the information for each individual object, I can drop it down, click on the instance, and then in the right panel, I can see the X position, the Y position, and so on, as well as any instance variables. In this case, this coin has 1 boolean called collected. By the way, if you're not able to instantiate objects here, ensure that this little lightning bolt icon on the bottom is deselected. If it is selected, then you're in raw mode, in which case you have access to some of the underlying information, but that's pretty risky and I wouldn't recommend playing with it. Now what's super useful about this pane is you can actually update variables in real time. So for example, this coin has a boolean which tells us if it's been collected, and it's currently set to false. If I set that to true, the coin is going to activate and then it's going to tween up and away. So if I click on this little pencil icon next to false, type in true, and then click on the check mark, observe that this coin is then going to trigger as collected and do the events I've told it to do. Similarly, if I go to my global variables and I want to update my score, which is reflected here in this text object, I have only to find my global current score variable, click on the pencil, and let's give ourselves 9,000 points. And bam, it's reflected right there. Unfortunately, there doesn't seem to be a way to sort these by alphabetical order or anything, but I can tell you that they are sorted in order of objects added to your game. So if you've added recent objects, they're going to be down here at the very bottom. By the way, don't forget that the debugger on the top right can actually be used to pause and unpause the game. Next, let's look at the console. On the top right, ensure that console is selected. You can drag this up to make it larger, and what you're going to see here is a series of logs. You don't always need to look at those, but I'll show you what you might want to look at. What we need to do next is actually send messages to the console. So close your preview and go back to your events. Within your events sheet, under an event of your choice, we're going to add an action. In this case, I'm going to add an action to log a message to the console every time I collect a coin. So add action, I type console and it pops up, log a message to the console. Within quotations, type whatever it is that you want. In this case, I'm going to type coin collected. Close it in quotations. And this can be of type info, warning, or error. Usually info will suffice, but if you've added a log on some event that's going to be a warning or an error, you can select those as well. You can leave the group of messages blank. Now press F6 or click on Start Preview and Debugger. Go back to the console, and what I find useful is clicking on Hide Details and Hide Show Internal. These are going to be things like callbacks, runtime serialization, and so on. What I care about most right now is looking for the event when I collect a coin. And now you can see coin collected every time I collect a coin. And you can place messages like this throughout your events to help really fine-tune where you're seeing events take place, to identify if an event is triggering as true, and so on. Now, if I were to change that message from type info to type warning, let's see what that looks like. Now it has a little warning icon next to it instead of the info sign. Keep in mind that you can actually log variables as well. So let's say I wanted to say coin collected with a score of, and then add the score. So add plus my variable name. And let's take a look. Now I see it says coin collected with a score of 1. Let's hide the details. Score of 2, score of 3, score of 4, and so on. Finally, let's look at the profiler. Let's hide the console and open the profiler. Drag this up to make it larger. Now with your game preview running and the profiler pulled up, first of all, click on refresh and then start profiling. Now give this about 10 seconds. It'll only capture the latest 10 seconds of profiling, even though it may run for longer. Click on stop, and what you'll see here is a breakdown of how much time GDevelop spent on all of the various activities. It looks like a lot of information, but let's break it down. You can see here that it's primarily sorted by objects from pre-events, such as callbacks, extensions. This is the stuff that takes place before your game loads. Then you have the in-game events. These are your events, the things that you wrote in the game. After that, you've got the post events, callbacks, layers, and renders. And most of the time, you'll want to spend debugging your own events. In this case, if you've defined any event groups, you'll see them listed out here. So if I go back to my event sheet, these blue lines are event groups. In this case, I have controls, collectibles, door, and enemies. So if I go back to my profiler here, I can see controls, collectibles, door, and enemies, and how much time was spent on those. By the way, to create an event group, all you need to do is click on a particular event. You can right-click to add event group. Alternatively, you can click on the plus sign up top and then select event group. Now you may find that it's showing 0 milliseconds for some of these events. If that's the case, you might want to start playing around in the game while the profiler is running. That way you can collect data. In this case, there's nothing too exciting because none of these events are taking a significantly long amount of time. However, if you run into a situation where you have an infinite loop, you're going to notice it here. So let's see what that looks like. In my events here, I've added a repeat 1000 times for a particular collision check. Now the event group for my enemies is at 100%, and it doesn't even know how many milliseconds it took. So I can see that it's particularly more expensive now. And if I see something like that show up when I'm debugging, that's definitely an area to dig into. So those are the basics of the debugger, and now I'm going to show you a few extra bonus tips to help you along the way. Remember how to log a message to the console? Well, I showed you how to log a variable to the console. In this case, let's try incrementing a variable and then logging it every time my player is next to a door and has the key. So again, log a message to the console, and we'll just say next to door plus, and then we need to add a variable here. So I'm going to create a scene variable, and we'll just call it test. It's a number and it's going to start at 0. And let's add test in here. Then we need to increment the variable. So change variable value, test, and we're going to +1 every time and hit OK. So again, log the message, then increment the variable. And this should trigger every single frame while this condition is true. And let's check it out. Don't forget to refresh, open the console. Now I'm going to grab that key and stand next to the door so that it's true. And now you can see it running away in the logs, incrementing every single frame. And if I pause, I can see it climbed all the way up to 388 frames. You can use this to your advantage because it'll tell you exactly how many times the log is triggered. And if you hide all the extra information, it'll also help you to differentiate between an otherwise identical log, and sometimes it looks like it's not even moving, but it is. Next, don't forget that you can use text objects to show troubleshooting items. In this case, I'm going to create a text object called test value and just hit apply. And I'm going to drag this out onto the scene somewhere, and I can have this tell me whatever I want. In this case, maybe instead of going back to the console every single time I want to debug this issue, maybe I just want the screen to appear on text. So let's take that same exact event and not just log it to the console, but let's also update the text object. So if I select the text object here, and then I update the text and assign that a text value plus that variable. This will tell me how many frames I've been standing next to the door. And it's going to update every single frame. And let's check it out. Don't forget, I should probably add that to the UI layer. There we go, and now we can see it right there on the screen. We don't have to go all the way back to the console, so voila. Now this next tip is super useful, and this goes hand in hand with optimization as well as troubleshooting. Click on the 3 bars on the top left, open extensions, type in FPS, install in project, and then close. Now let's navigate back to the event. What I'm going to do is delete this event to update the text object, and we're going to update it somewhere else. In my main scene, I'm just going to update it to show the frames per second. I'm going to select a no condition event and add an action. I'm going to update the text object. I'm going to type in quotations FPS, close quotations, plus, and then type FPS, and what you need should pop up if you have the extension now, and apply. Now let's preview. Now we can see the frames per second right there on the screen, so if anything drops my frames, I'm going to know it. Now that's going to give us a very long decimal, so let's fix that. What we want to do is round the number. So click back into the text here, and after it says to string parenthesis, inside of that first parenthesis, type in lowercase round, open parenthesis, and then close the whole thing in one more parenthesis, and hit preview. Now we can see just the full integers. And I generally like to just have this all the time anyway. Next is the very final tip I have for you. And it kind of wraps up all the advice I've given you so far into one final step. Here in the main editor, add a new object, select a toggle switch, drag that out onto the scene somewhere, and don't forget to set that to your UI layer. If you don't already have a UI layer, I recommend you do so. Make sure that the UI layer is up on the top of the rest. By the way, if you don't see your layers pane, you can access that up here on the top right by clicking on the 3 layers icon. We're going to add a new layer, and I'm going to call it Debug. Then I'm going to drag it down under the UI, but it's going to be on top of my base layer. And I'm going to select all the text objects that I've added for troubleshooting, and I'm going to add those to my debug layer. Then in my main scene, I'm going to add a condition. Find your toggle switch, and then look for the condition is checked. If is checked, add action. We're going to show a layer, debug layer, and then copy and paste that whole event, and then invert. If the switch is not checked, then in this case, we want to hide the layer, and preview. And preview. Now I can just playtest the game as normal. But if I want to start looking at some information and I don't want to go all the way to the console, I can just check the toggle switch here, and boom, there's all of my troubleshooting text objects, or whatever else I want to show or hide. And now I've shown you the basics of the GDevelop debugger, including the inspector, the profiler, and the console. And you have a few tools in your arsenal now, so don't give up because of a few bugs. Special thanks to Lost in Code, who's helped me debug my own games along the way, and also thanks to my patrons. It's a great community, and if you'd like to join us in the Discord, feel free to do so, link below. Like and subscribe for more content, and until next time, I hope you have fewer bugs than I do. Thanks.